Welcome to the Nicole Osei Report. I'm Nicole Osei, and today we're going to be talking about the Trump administration's steps in their effort to dismantle the Department of Education and how that will impact educator students and their families nationwide. Joining me today is Zeph Capo, president of the Texas chapter of the American Federation of Teachers Union. Welcome.
Nicole, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here with you.
So earlier this week, the Department of Education slashed half of its workforce. And in a subsequent interview, Education Secretary Linda McMahon confirmed that this indeed was the first step in their effort to dismantle the DOE. I want to get your reaction to what we saw this week. And also, if you could talk about what the Department of Education's role is in public schools.
Yeah, I think first of all, what we saw an attempt to create tax breaks for the wealthy on the backs of kids, and not just any kids. The students in the programs that the 10 or 15% of the federal budget that is covered by our school districts that goes to supplement actually goes to our most vulnerable kids, our neediest kids. For example, the U.S. Department of Education and its funding services across the country about 26 million vulnerable kids. 7.5 million of those kids have disabilities and working through some type of special education services. Um, 10 million students are losing grants and loans that is making it possible, or could lose grants and loans to make it possible for them to attain higher education. 12 million students could lose access to career and technical education programs because the Perkins grants that are provided by the Department of Education and federal funding are what makes our school districts able to provide the types of career and technical education programs that result in kids being able to obtain high-paying jobs straight out of high school. A lot of this equipment, a lot of these programs are deeply expensive, and for school districts to be able to do this on their own, we know that it would take a significant local tax increase to make that happen.
Was there any effort by the Trump administration to actually find out what the employees, in terms of the people that they cut, what they actually did, how their workload would be allocated, and then how that's going to impact productivity in this new situation?
We haven't been able to see any rhyme or reason to, frankly, any of the decisions that are being made, particularly with the ones with the Department of Education. The new secretary was just confirmed, and right on the heels of her confirmation comes this 50% reduction. And I know that there's been a lot of back and forth on the president releasing an executive order on the Department of Education, but we all know that the Department of Education and its funding is actually established by Congress. And they can certainly do some damage, and we see that happening right now. Um, what that's going to end up being in the long run is anyone's guess, but we know that the loss of these services to students right now will directly impact kids in school trying to make it through immediately, while these political um, games are being played in Washington and frankly in Austin as well.
And as you mentioned, as another point that you brought up that I think is missing from the conversation, that'll also affect the economy down the road.
Well, absolutely. We have a shortage of the high skilled workers that we need, particularly in our state in Texas. That is why focusing on career and technical education, that is why getting students the types of credentials that will actually matter to the workforce. That is why making sure that all of our students have our access to a high quality educational program and educational foundation is important. Title I funds, which is one of the largest funding blocks that come from the federal government, provide funding directly to school districts and directly to schools based on the enrolled students in each school. And having schools not be able to depend on that type of funding may very well be the difference in whether students have paper and pencils and things to actually, the most basic tools to be able to work with.
Trump has said that he wants to return education authority back to the states. Give me your thoughts on that. And because when I was listening to that, I was thinking, okay, well, going that route, that would mean that depending on what state you live in, you're gonna, if your child is enrolled in public school, they could fare differently. You know, a wealthier state like California, those kids are going to fare different than a poorer state like Kentucky, Oklahoma, Louisiana. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think this is a short-sighted talking point that's being put out there by him and Doge to make the shock of what they're doing a little bit easier to swallow. But it doesn't really work out because the truth is states and school districts already do control education. Um, the federal funding covers maybe 10 to 15% of any school district or state's budget for their particular students. And so, what is happening there is the federal government, Congress, has appropriated money for strategic areas of importance to help augment what school districts are doing and help support particular areas that they find to be a priority. They do not, and they are not by law allowed to make decisions about how those students learn, what they learn. They can't be involved in the curricular decisions. So the fact of the matter is, they're really providing money with guidelines and holding districts accountable to utilizing that money in the manner in which it was intended to be used. Other than that, states and school districts make all of the decisions on the educational curriculum and system and supports that are provided to the students.
And speaking of holding districts accountable, I want to go over to the DOE Civil Rights Branch. We saw that I think it was about 7 of the 12 offices, including one here in North Texas, Dallas, were shuttered. Can you talk about what types of cases those offices handled and how those cases are going to be affected now?
Yeah, this is one of the travesties of these decisions because oftentimes those individuals in the civil rights department are often the last and only opportunity that families have for addressing issues that they do not feel have met the needs of their students. They're usually the option of last resort to ensure that individual students, children's, and families' rights to a free and appropriate education, rights to the supports that they should have, are implemented. Most of, I would probably say, the overwhelming, the supermajority of those cases usually involve students with disabilities, special education families, where districts may or may not necessarily be one using the funds that the federal government has allocated for that purpose and for those students. That is the baseline where we usually see most of these cases. And parents are often going to the civil rights office to fight for the compensatory time, the educational supports that are needed to meet the needs of their particular kids. Because I have too often seen with my own eyes, I've sat in ARDs with parents and teachers where we have had to fight tooth and nail to get districts to cover services that were vastly needed by students because they don't want to pay them out of their pocket. And then we've also had to fight to make sure that the resources coming from the federal government were actually used for the purposes intended. For example, our paraprofessionals, which are often the first line of caregivers for kids that come to school that can't take care of themselves, without having that civil rights office, without having someone that can help enforce it, the likelihood that the student's paraprofessional, who usually takes care of their biological needs, takes care of making sure that they're fed and clothed and appropriately kept safe during the school day could easily be pulled to do lunch duty, bus duty, something that doesn't involve those children at all. And even with the Civil Rights Office being there, and even with the regulations being in place, we still have to fight for their enforcement to this very day. And the fact that they're leaving is going to be a tremendous detriment to those most vulnerable kids.
I saw an interview on the Rachel Maddow show with OCR attorney Sharia Smith, who was out of the Dallas office that was shuttered. And she had alleged that the cuts disproportionately impacted women and people of color, and that the vast majority of those who were kept on were white men who went to conservative universities. Can you speak to that? If that's true, what message is the Trump administration sending not only to DOE employees, but also educators and students nationwide?
Well, it's clearly sending a message that we aren't really looking at merit and need, and we're looking at who supports our political program. And that's what we've been saying all along. Most of these decisions are political. And this is not a place for that. Politics should not be so far embedded in our public education system, because public education really shouldn't be a partisan issue. And it's extremely unfortunate. It sends a terrible message to most of the public school students that we serve, particularly because, frankly, most of our public school students now are children of color, are minorities, may be less well off than others, and we are frankly going to be ripping the rug out from under them when when what has been provided by the Department of Education has been a fundamental level lifeline for support, to get them to the place where they could take on jobs as attorneys and do the work that's being done as well too. So unfortunately, I think that we're going to have to relitigate and refight the battles that have been waged in the past, and remind people why we have an Office of Civil Rights, remind people why we have had to put into people's faces what the truth is about what's happening, and why everyone should have a fair opportunity at a shot in both our economy and in our country.
I want to go a few years back because I remember seeing this push here in Texas, but also in other states, where you saw this push by conservatives showing up to school board meetings, people that were getting elected to those boards. And we saw book banning in several states, including here in Texas. A lot of those were minority authors. And there was an attempt to kind of wash American history, to whitewash American history. We saw programs trying to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in public schools. And I was wondering, do you think that we were seeing Project 2025, at least the seedlings of it, even back then?
Absolutely. I mean, the architect of Project 2025 comes from Texas, comes out of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So it is absolutely no surprise that Texas has been an incubator for these horrific policies. Let's be truthful about it. Um, Many of these folks that are trying to push these things through are doing it because they don't want to be comfortable and don't want to own what has happened in the past. We have never taught history in a full history, an accountable history. I mean, like, I'm Generation X, and we just celebrated, or we just recognized the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Alabama. I didn't learn about that in school. I learned about that from an Irish rock band. So the fact is that they have never really taught history from everyone's perspective. And the fact that there was now progress moving in that direction really, in many ways, I think challenged people's power, made them feel uncomfortable. And unfortunately, their comfort is more important to them than the needs of all of our citizens. And that's the way a lot of us see what they're doing and what they're putting forward. And that's a shame because it pulls all of us down.
Who's going to be the most hurt by these actions? And I get that this is multifaceted. Who's going to be caught in the crossfire here?
I mean, short term and most directly, poor kids, disabled students, and adults, working adults that are going back to school at the community college level in particular, or to reskill themselves, are the three groups that I think are potentially going to be hurt by this. But in the long run, because of the good point that you made about our overall economy and frankly our democracy in this country, all of us, every single one of us, are going to be hurt in the long run by this.
And I want to now talk about the legal battle that we're just seeing. So, dozens of attorneys generals filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration to block their efforts to slash the workforce. Do you think that this effort is going to work? And what other things are being talked about to kind of fight what's going on?
I think it will work, particularly in the short run. Regardless of what far too many people in this country may think, we did not crown a king. We are still a federal democracy, a republic, and we are still a country based on the rule of law. Unfortunately, in many places, in government, in business, in other words, the law is only as good as the enforcement of the law. That is why they often detest unions. That is why they detest civil rights organizations and others that attempt to hold them accountable. I am glad Sharia was there for her members. I am so glad that others who have filed lawsuits for probationary employees that were improperly terminated um, are going to have their say or going to have an attempt to make their case in court. What will happen in the long run? Because there are ways that they could make these reductions, but they have to do it the right way. They have to go back to Congress. They have to actually pass the congressional budget pieces that go through this. They actually have to follow the law in insofar as the employment practices for all of these employees, and bullies are not used to doing that.
I also want to ask you about just the disconnect. There seems to be, well, what do you think the disconnect is when it comes to this administration and its view of the country versus what most Americans, everyday citizens, are actually dealing with when it comes to education and things of that nature? There's a clear disconnect here.
If I was being frank and straightforward, I think that there's a lot of America that fell for the old okey doke. Frankly, you heard a lot of lip service about bread and butter issues, about kitchen table issues that have done nothing but get worse under this administration. And in particular, because of policies this administration has put forward, whether they be tariffs or all of the cutting of services that are provided to families to increase the tax breaks for the wealthy. Um, this is not what I think the American people voted for. But all of the signs were there ahead of time for anybody who was paying attention that you were not going to get what you thought you were going to get. And people refuse to broaden their sources of information. They refuse to critically think and analyze through a lot of this work. I mean, look at every red blinking light was there in the first place that this was going to be a dangerous decision. Yet we chose to do it anyway because we succumbed to a system that has been put in place by the oligarchs, by the very rich people. They're controlling the narrative when it comes to social media and communication channels. And we have to depend on one another if we're going to save our democracy, to question everyone. Don't question everybody. Question me. Question, but certainly question the billionaires who, you somehow have been hoodwinked into believing have your best interest at heart. When the bottom line is, and we all know it, it's their bottom line that is in their interest.
And to wrap up, what can everyday citizens who are concerned about what's going on, what can they do to help educators, to help students, to help save the Department of Education? What can they do?
I mean, first and foremost, if you have anybody that is in your family that is, you know, going back to community college, is in need of special education services, are in need of, kind of a hand up to get through and work through these things. If you care about your community, if you care about the neighbors across the street and down the road, call your representatives and say, picking on our most vulnerable kids is not the best policy to move us forward. Congress needs to stand up. Congress is a separate branch of government from the executive branch for a reason. And they need to make sure that they are speaking out for the people that elected them, but they have to hear from the people that elected them. And I know some of them are now running from town halls and don't want to be there because they're really uncomfortable because the people are not happy. They've got to keep that up. Don't let them off the hook. Flood their offices with letters, with calls, and keep the pressure on.
Zeph, thank you so much for joining me. And for those of you who are watching, comment down below. What do you think of the Trump administration's effort to dismantle the Department of Education? And what would you like to see happen? What are you most concerned about? And if you like this kind of content, news, politics, and current trends, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.